If you said that Andrei Tarkovsky was the greatest filmmaker of all time, I would struggle to make a case against it. Across his 7 feature films and assortment of other works, Tarkovsky reached spiritual and emotional depths that other directors could only dream of diving down to. An artist in the truest sense of the word, he pulled from painting, sculpture, music, theatre, philosophy, religion, and history to create his works. The music that Tarkovsky chooses to accompany his frames with is deliberate, varied, and surprisingly sparing. With his 2 composers, Vyacheslav Ovchinnikov and Eduard Artymev, as well as a variety of other works, both Eastern and Western, Tarkovsky's sound worlds are an endless well of interesting pieces and philosophies that we'll take a deep dive into in this video. Though one can examine his entire filmography to see Tarkovsky's evolving use of music, we'll focus on 2 films from the middle period of his career, Stalker and Mirror. Stalker, probably Tarkovsky's most famous film, is likely the one that most people watching this will have seen, and therefore probably the best as a broad frame of reference. It also uses a great mixture of originally composed music and works from the classical canon, an extremely broad and varied range of music that covers a lot of what Tarkovsky did. Mirror, as his most autobiographical and idiosyncratic work, perhaps best demonstrates the uniqueness of Tarkovsky's approach to sound and music. His earlier films, like Ivan's Childhood and Andrei Rublev, brilliant though they are, incorporate orchestral film scores in a fairly conventional manner, except when mentioned here. Though I'll focus on these 2 films, I'll also be referencing many of his other works, films and otherwise, so this video contains spoilers for all of Tarkovsky's works, though that shouldn't matter too much because he's not really a plot guy. Before looking at his films specifically, Tarkovsky left a wealth of writing dissecting his philosophy of art in general and filmmaking in particular, most notably his 1985 book Sculpting in Time. As he views it, most films have a mechanical and arbitrary way of tagging music onto the picture, a facile system of illustration. This begins with silent films, which did this in a more literal sense, before sound films emerged with scenes propped up with a musical accompaniment which reiterates the main theme in order to heighten its emotional resonance, or sometimes just to make the best of a scene that hasn't worked. Eduard Artymev, who composed for 3 of Tarkovsky's films, and both ones discussed in depth in this video, had this to say of Tarkovsky's attitude towards film music. I was struck by his attitude to music and film, precisely in his films. He told me right away that he didn't need a composer at all. He needed the composer's ear and masterful command of sound in order to mix music, to make musical effects. This philosophy towards film music reminds me of a lot less dogmatic Dogma 95, the Danish avant-garde film movement from the 1990s. I've got a whole video about that, but in short, if music is needed to help with tone, pacing, emotion, characterization, and continuity, then it is a crutch where the techniques of filmmaking and acting should be used instead. As I mentioned in that video, this approach is by no means unique. Stravinsky said in 1946 that the only real function of film music is to feed the composer. One then might expect that Tarkovsky's films are almost proto-dogmatic in their use of music, but this isn't really true. Perhaps Tarkovsky's most widely repeated quote about film music is this: "I have to say, in my heart of hearts, I don't believe films need music at all. However, I have not yet made a film without it." Why, then, did Tarkovsky use music in his films if he held this view? Well, on one hand, he didn't really use very much. There's not heaps of music in his films. Not only does that stop it being a crutch for him to walk but never run, but it lends greater weight when it is used. The Steamroller and the Violin, Tarkovsky's 45-minute diploma film from 1961, was criticised when it was made for its relative lack of music. Further, Tarkovsky himself never put much stock into the originally composed music for his films. An auteur, a perfectionist, call him what you will, but Tarkovsky generally left Artymev alone to get on with the music. Of course, this didn't mean that he would accept blindly whatever was given, which must have been more than frustrating for the composer, but Tarkovsky generally left his composers, as Artymev himself put it, in limbo to guess what might fit and where. That being said, both composers who worked extensively with Tarkovsky noted that he knew far more about music than most other directors they worked with, and that they would often be involved from a much earlier stage in the filmmaking process than with other directors. Tarkovsky called cinema the one art where the author can see himself as the creator of an unconditional reality. Film is an emotional reality, and that is how the audience receives it, as a second reality. But cinema's greatest asset may also prove its greatest weakness, that it is a composite art. It blends painting, photography, literature, music, sound design, architecture, acting, fashion, and lots more into a strange and overwhelming mesh. As we see in the wealth of great film, this has enormous potential, but more ingredients don't create a better dish, and Tarkovsky felt that often, at best, created a mere semblance of harmony. Music, then, should not be added without consideration, and it should not just illustrate the emotion of the scene, which the scene can do itself, but open up the possibility of a new, transfigured impression of the same material, something different in kind. But another reason Tarkovsky included music, in particular non-electronic music, is that it created roots. Not only is cinema a composite art, running all those associated risks, but cinema is also a relatively new art. Tarkovsky said that because film is such a young art without the precedent of, say, music or painting, connections had to be made to the old masters to forge the, quote, deep roots required to show that cinema is not something entirely new, but simply a new way of presenting. Now, this applies to painting as much as it does music, if not more so, but it's still relevant to our discussion here. Tarkovsky, on a personal level, clearly held a great passion for music, even seriously considering training professionally. Many of Tarkovsky's works then find themselves stuffed with musical and artistic history. Piero della Francesca's Madonna del Parto in Nostalgia, Peter Bruegel the Elder's The Hunters in the Snow in Solaris, and alluded to in The Mirror, the entire film of Andrei Rublev. These are but a few examples of Tarkovsky packing his films with paintings. Each image serves its own purpose and contains within it unique meanings, but when looking at his filmography holistically, it creates links between Tarkovsky's cinema and the history of European artistic achievement. And it isn't just European high art either. Folk songs, herding calls, Eastern flute performances all find their place in his films. While some, like Johnson and Petrie, see this as creating a jarring stylistic dissonance, I feel it places Tarkovsky's work at the heart of the history of human art, rather than having cinema exist as something fundamentally different and fundamentally new. This is the case with music as much as it is with painting. Of the Bach and Pergolesi in Mirror, alongside Pushkin's writing and images of Soviet history, Tarkovsky said that he wanted to create a link between these things and the domestic events which form the film's essential plot, that these things constitute an equally important aspect of the human experience. The Beethoven in Stalker, the Bach in Solaris and Mirror all pair Tarkovsky with an artistic history that he can work with and reference. It's particularly interesting that many of these figures aren't Russian. Andrei Rublev is, Pushkin is, but Tarkovsky seemingly had little interest in pulling from the wealth of great Russian classical music. It's something that transcends nationality, because that is precisely the point. Western classical music, then, forms an important part of Tarkovsky's musical world. To turn to one of our two films, let's have a look at how Mirror incorporates classical music. Mirror is a very non-linear film, and if you said you understood it the first time you saw it, I'd probably think you were lying. I didn't have a clue what it was on about the first time I'd seen it, to be honest. It jumps between past and present, has the same actors playing different roles, and even jumps between reality and unreality. Some of it contains montages of various documentary footage from moments in Russian and world history. We see newsreel footage of the Spanish Civil War as flamenco plays. The montage is, at first, somewhat jarring because it's not yet contextualised and only really made sense to me upon a rewatch of the film. This then moves to silence and footage of a Soviet balloon ascent, at first in total silence, before Quando Corpus Moritur, the final part of Giovanni Battista Pergolesi's Stabat Mater plays. This text has been set to music by countless composers, Vivaldi, Liszt, Penderecki, Verdi, and many, many more, but Pergolesi's is one of the more notable ones. For a string quartet, soprano and alto voices, the piece has a distinctly harrowing nature. Its largo tempo, tonic dominant movement in F minor, and held powerful suspensions give the piece a really heavy weight. The B diminished seventh chords, heard with frequency, also somewhat destabilise the harmony, whilst the regular rhythms keep it firm. Born in 1932, moments of 1930s Soviet history are embedded into Tarkovsky's life. Pontara calls the scene, one in which the ballooners would perish from the flight, an elegy on the transience of human life. This becomes clear if you look at the words, especially when considering the nature of the film as a whole, one of a man reflecting from his deathbed. While my body here decays, may my soul thy goodness praise, safe in paradise with thee. Tarkovsky's most persistent musical obsession was with potentially the greatest musician to ever live, Johann Sebastian Bach. When describing the qualities that make an exceptional artist, Tarkovsky lists three names quite casually in his examples: Leonardo da Vinci, Leo Tolstoy, and J.S. Bach. Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, Mozart, all ranked highly, at least in Tarkovsky's early years, but Bach stood above all. This is quite a sober, conservative taste. He had little interest in contemporary composition and retained a special dislike of Shostakovich. As time went by, Tarkovsky grew more and more weary of Western Romanticism and its focus on the self. He called Beethoven and Wagner an unending monologue about oneself, manifesting themselves as 19th century Prometheuses, plagued by constant suffering. Bach, like Da Vinci and Tolstoy, never succumbed to this. Of Ingmar Bergman's Cries and Whispers, Tarkovsky writes that Bach lends a particular volume and depth to everything that occurs on screen. Thanks to Bach and the rejection of dialogue by the characters, there appears in the scene a kind of vacuum. Though appearing significantly in Solaris, Mirror is stuffed full of Bach. This isn't particularly surprising. Tarkovsky himself pointed to it as part of the author's memory and biographical tissue, and Mirror is incredibly autobiographical. We see a scene of a young Alexei and his sister reuniting with their father upon his return from the war, whilst a dramatic passage of Bach plays. This passage of music is used almost identically by Bach in both St. John Passion and St. Matthew Passion. The version we hear in Mirror is from St. John Passion, though many sources incorrectly label it as if it was from St. Matthew Passion. It's very dramatic and emotive, shooting from a long, held B major on organ to a D-sharp diminished seventh, as the vocal leaps up and down, covering a range of an octave and a half, backed up by these quick scales. Pontara sees this scene as despairing. In a split second, all the dreams the young boy may have nurtured about his father's return to the family are destroyed, and the exploding sense of confusion and despair that replaces it reverberates through the soundtrack in the form of a powerfully rumbling electronic thunder. I certainly agree that it's not a happy scene, but I don't think it's despairing. I just don't hear it in the music. The sound is exaltation. It's cathartic because of the brevity which it is forced to have. All that emotion compressed into such little time. It overloads the system, so to speak. At the end of the scene, with the Bach still playing, the camera cuts to Ginevra da Benci by Leonardo da Vinci, a portrait from the 1470s of a Florentine aristocrat of the same name. As well as establishing those deep roots we spoke of earlier, it ties Maria to the Renaissance world of Leonardo. Of the picture, Tarkovsky says, "We will need this portrait in order to confront it with the heroine and to emphasize both in her and in the actress Margarita Terahova, who plays the main role, the same ability to be charming and repulsive at the same time." Elena Dogheru, in her analysis of the portrait, writes that the inner world of the main heroine is reflected in Leonardo's canvas. Tarkovsky visually connects the biographical plot with the sacred themes of eternity, immortality, the antinomic perfection of man, and the salvation of the soul, using the symbolically rich Renaissance imagery created by Leonardo da Vinci. At the end, the Bach bleeds into a dissonant mess of electronic noise. Pontara claims this is the only mixing of electronic and classical music in Mirror, which isn't exactly true. In fact, the aforementioned Pergolesi is ended by an alien intrusion of electronic music, cutting off the classical, but it is one of the more noteworthy moments of it.
Ignat!
The final scene in Mirror is perhaps the most expressive use of Bach in Tarkovsky's entire filmography. Crickets chirp and the opening of Bach's St. John Passion begins to play. The camera pans from a field to the trees, before lowering to show a pregnant Maria and Alexei's father laying in the grass. This is the most at peace we've seen them throughout the film. The constant semiquavers in the strings and dense clusters of notes in the brass create a real anxiety as the music slowly crescendos. But it's the entry of the choir where the music really explodes, exclaiming hair in charged forte to the powerful tonic and dominant. This exact moment sees the first cut in nearly 2 minutes, moving away from the two humans and showing the trees again, before panning to an aged Maria and her two young children. Where the choir takes on the same semiquavers is where the anxiety really comes through. We then get an extended shot close to the ground, showing various natural and human debris. Pontara sees the scene as possessing a curious mix of bereavement and contentment, that the Bach creates an expression of rapprochement and elevated joy that transfers to the scene's images and imbues the ending of the film with a sense of contentment and reconciliation. Pontara's ideas of rapprochement and reconciliation are interesting, But this moment is where I hear the existential dread and despair that he hears in St. John Passion earlier in the film. Humanity seems so small at this point, nature and God so powerful by contrast. I always think the choir sounds a bit like Ligoti's Requiem if it were written a few hundred years earlier. The grandeur of nature, the grandeur of the piece, Maria's aging in a mere moment, Park here ties the film to a grander narrative of human history and art, as well as human interaction with nature, and creates a sense of harrowing futility. It imbues the moss, the wood, and the shrubs all with a sense of profound terror. In Stalker, this is seen near the end, where Ravel's Bolero is heard. The three men sit on the floor for an extended period before we see the cracked floor covered in water with a few fish swimming in it. Over the second shot, Bolero plays. To be honest, Bolero has since become reified into a very boring piece, quite beige and skating, but it takes on a revivified life if you consider it as a march of industrial terror. The three men in the shadow of technical progress and industrial decay whilst Bolero plays around them. Spinitskaya points out that Ravel's piece itself was inspired by factories, that he loved seeing them at work and machinery whirling around, that Bolero should always be played with a factory in the background. Of machinery and music, Ravel ponders, do I think that at some future date we shall see on a concert platform rows of typewriters, lathes and saws in place of the usual instruments? It's not improbable, but if it does come about, I do not think that it can truly be called art. Ravel died in 1937, aged 62. Who knows how his music would have changed if he got another 20 years to see the developments in machines making music. But Tarkovsky himself seems to provide somewhat of an answer to this question in his employment of nature and mechanical sounds. For Tarkovsky, music was all around us, and not just in the instruments we traditionally associate with it. He, for instance, would listen to the rumble of a train chugging along the tracks and listen for the rhythm within it, hearing this as just as musical as anything of Beethoven's. Hollowegger writes that Tarkovsky's approach to sound yields two main concerns, an appreciation of the beauty of sounds and a need to listen to them, as he put it, properly. Robert Bird called Tarkovsky's 1965 radio adaptation of William Faulkner's Turnabout the best illustration of Tarkovsky's oral aesthetics. Faulkner, a writer officially endorsed in the Soviet Union, tells a tale of World War I in which an American Navy pilot rescues a British soldier. Ovchinnikov was at the helm for the musical parts of the production, but Tarkovsky himself took painstaking care over the sound design. Ove Svensson, sound engineer on Tarkovsky's Sacrifice, noted that the image came indisputably first for Tarkovsky. In absence of this, he was forced to spend more time on the audio, going to Riga himself to record things such as seagulls and ships. Look through Tarkovsky's films and listen to the birds. Here, for instance, in Andrei Rublev, the sound of live birds is foregrounded as the dead bird is prodded and poked. Hollowegger draws a parallel between Tarkovsky's approach to the incorporation of nature and a broader transfigured ruralism in Western music of the time, specifically that of Messiaen. Messiaen said that the only music has always existed in the sounds of nature, the harmony of the wind in the trees, the rhythm of the waves in the ocean, the timbre of the raindrops, the breaking branches, the impact of stones, the different animal cries are, for me, the real music. Hollowegger mentions that Messiaen's own works are certainly more literal than previous incorporation of birdsong by the likes of Vivaldi, though it is worth a side note that Messiaen's bird transcriptions, whilst creating the impression of birdsong, often bear little actual resemblance to the birds in question. From Trevor Hold's spectrographic analysis of both Messiaen's birds and the corresponding actual birds, we learn that they're not all that close together. For instance, Messiaen's nightingale in Réveil des Oiseaux sings too slowly, too continuously, and too regularly to be much like an actual nightingale. As Hold points out himself, Messiaen's comments in the written introduction to the piece reveal that this probably wasn't his intention. As far as its relation to Tarkovsky, this is the sense that the sound is the material, pulling on these parallel developments in music. On the other hand, since the advent of films with sound, this kind of sound has kind of been used by default. Western music, more formal by its nature, requires breaking a lot to include this kind of sound. But birds, insects, water, wind, this is the world that Tarkovsky's sound creates. Puer defines the soundscape of the zone in Stalker in this way, one of rushing waters, the chirping of birds, and the buzzing of insects. This perhaps is the best moment to move on to Tarkovsky's other main musical interest, electronic music. Tarkovsky described the style as possessing enormously rich possibilities for cinema, that where instrumental music is artistically so autonomous that it is far harder for it to dissolve into the film to the point where it becomes an organic part of it, this compromise is far less with electronic music. In Tarkovsky's time, it wasn't exactly brand new, but it was still new and unknown enough that it retained its novel decontextualization. Electronic music wasn't wholly decontextualized in Tarkovsky's mind. It's worth noting that he felt that it still must be purged of its chemical origins, but it certainly was more so than the alternative. Sounds created with instruments like the EMS Synthi 100, which was used in the theme for Stalker, create sounds removed from any kind of historical context, allowing Tarkovsky to be free and unburdened from the very artistic history he used classical music to tie himself to. Hollowega points to the work of Pauline Oliveros, saying that in the early pieces for the Buchla synthesizer by Pauline Oliveros, one can literally hear the composer searching for the music within this new and at times hard to control music machine. This isn't actually related to Tarkovsky at all, but I just wanted to tell this story about my quite strange introduction to Pauline Oliveros. I'd woken up after quite a peculiar night out in Bulgaria. It was one of the strangest hostels I'd ever stayed in, a big, disused inn with no windows, dim lights, and maybe 20 single mattresses dotted across the floor. I woke up and my headphones were in, listening to a record called New Music for Electronic and Recorded Media, Women in Electronic Music, 1977, playing Pauline Oliveros' Bye Bye Butterfly, which sounds like this. Needless to say, I thought I'd woken up in a different dimension until I fully woke up and came to. I'd recommend the record to anyone, by the way, who likes experimental music. There's some unbelievable stuff on there. An instance of electronic sound worth discussion in a little more detail is in the scene with the teacup in Mirror. Ignat, Alexei's young son, reads a letter from Pushkin to an unknown woman. After going and answering the door to a woman with the appearance of his grandmother, though neither recognise one another, Ignat returns and the woman has disappeared. The heat mark of the teacup the woman was drinking from is shown, and the music rises to a panic crescendo as the condensation dissipates. There's a guy here on YouTube who's done an entire 45-minute video just on this one moment in Mirror, so if you're really interested, he's covered it very well and it's in the sources in the description, but I'll talk about it briefly. Pontara calls the music a sonic manifestation of the nature of the scene as something impossible, something other. Johnson and Petrie agree that music is underscoring the reality of this rationally inexplicable event. I pretty much agree with this. Dream and reality will become merged in the final scene of Mirror, and this makes sense, for it's the most unreal scene in the sense that it takes place after Alexei has died. But the music here marks some of the first intrusions of the or supernatural that previously were confined to their own scenes into those real. I think the silence after the music is also just as important. It would be very easy for the music to reach its crescendo and drop into silence right as the condensation evaporated. But there is another 5 or 6 seconds of silent condensation dissipating. This pulls it a little further into reality, but also creates the sense that fundamentally you are just watching condensation disappear in silence. It's so domestic, but so unreal. Often strange mechanical sound takes the place of music for Tarkovsky. Smith points to the handcar in Stalker. The scene isn't bogged down by overtly manipulative sound or prescriptive music, but the cold and industrial noise of the handcar takes the rhythmic place of the music. Electronic music, though used frequently from Solaris onwards, was perhaps most effectively used by Tarkovsky when he combined it with traditional acoustic music, something which he achieved in a variety of ways. The main theme of Stalker, which is probably the most famous individual piece of specially composed music in any Tarkovsky film, is emblematic of his combination of electronic and acoustic music. Before the main theme comes in, the first thing one will notice is the strange electronic hum of the aforementioned EMS Synthi 100. This is the electronic component of the piece, soon joined by the likely unfamiliar sound of the tar. The tar is found in various regions, Iran, Central Asia and the Caucasus, though it's probably most associated with Persian music. In this instance, however, it was an Armenian player in the Azerbaijani tradition. Artymev asked him to not play the traditional mugams of Azerbaijani music. instead asking him to draw on Indian improvisational techniques. As Artymev himself put it, the veena, an instrument of Hindustani classical music, hums the main tone, and the solo instrument, the sitar, begins modulating to the theme's variations. The main melody then joins on the recorder. Though pretty much every society has figured out some kind of recorder or another, it's generally, at least in this sense, associated with Europe and the European Middle Ages. Artymev then casts a wide geographical net in the Stalker theme, but also he casts a wide temporal net with the mix of electronic and acoustic instruments, lending the piece its genuinely transcendental aura. The final scene in Stalker yields another good example. We slowly zoom into Monkey's face as a powerful train sound begins, and Ode to Joy from Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 is heard underneath. Strictly speaking, this isn't electronic and acoustic music, this is acoustic music and mechanical sound. But as I said earlier, Tarkovsky felt the rhythms of trains chugging were just as musical as anything Beethoven ever composed, the music of machines. But that is being deliberately obtuse, it's not music in a traditional sense. Pontara calls this scene a massive critique of modern civilization, a faint and fading echo of the restless striving of humanity as it tries to make sense of, conquer, and colonize the universe without, as well as the universe within. Ode to Joy is such a ubiquitous piece. It's so associated with brotherhood, heroism, and, well, joy, that something feels so wrong hearing it struggling to be heard over the mechanical sound of machines. Very much the same effect is created near the beginning of the film, as the stalker's wife writhes in despair to the sound of brass, contorted by trains. Even when not literally overlapping, Tarkovsky contrasts electronic and acoustic music to great effect. Recall the scene in Mirror of Alexei and his father briefly reuniting to St. John Passion discussed earlier. As I said, my reading of the scene is that of brief but emotionally overwhelming catharsis, even if that catharsis is only for a short amount of time. We see Leonardo da Vinci in the book again, the children running and Maria looking in silence. This is accompanied by low and foreboding electronic sounds. Until it explodes startlingly into Bach's organ. The contrast between the two pieces makes the moment Bach comes in even more powerful, but it's also important that the low electronic music is heard over the picture of Leonardo da Vinci, but the Bach is heard over the actual painting by Leonardo da Vinci at the end of the scene. Of his love of Leonardo, and Tolstoy and Bach, Tarkovsky described his amazing capacity to examine the object from outside, standing back, looking from above at the world. The electronic music over the artist then disconnects Leonardo, placing him in the position of disinterested, pure artist. The Bach, on the other hand, playing as the painting is showing, is reflective of the actual content of the work, the sheer artistic quality and beauty created by Leonardo, looking above at the world. Okay, so that was quite a lot of specific examples, mostly from Mirror and Stalker. So let's bring this all back round to that initial philosophy we were talking about at the beginning. A little over halfway into Stalker, the titular character embarks upon a monologue about music itself. Though this is not Tarkovsky speaking, it is the Stalker, and one should always be careful in assigning the words of a character to the thoughts of the author. It does display the same ideas as outlined in Sculpting in Time. Tarkovsky there writes that music is free of ideology. A sound can exist as a contextless particle of music in a way that a word cannot exist without context. Dispassionate. This reminds me of the views of one of Tarkovsky's own heroes, Tolstoy, and I think it's no coincidence that the two great Russian artists shared such thoughts about music. If you've seen my video on those opposed to music, then firstly I apologise for repeating myself here, but if you haven't, go watch it after this, I think it's a good one. Tolstoy was not against music in the same way Kant, Volodymyr or Dali were. He loved it, as Tarkovsky did, and viewed it as possessing immense power, but through irrationality. Tolstoy's work expresses similar sentiments regarding music to that of Tarkovsky's. A speech by Posnashev, the protagonist of Tolstoy's novella The Kreutzer Sonata, engages in a monologue strikingly similar to that of the Stalker. A bit like with the Stalker and Tarkovsky, Posnashev's own words are not that of Tolstoy, but his own son, and musician in his own right, Sergei Tolstoy, said they were representative of the real Tolstoy's views, and he knew Tolstoy better than either of us. Since Tarkovsky was such an admirer of Tolstoy, and in all likelihood would have read works like What is Art and the Kreutzer Sonata, I posit that the Stalker's speech is a direct reference to this speech by Posnichev in the Kreutzer Sonata. A terrible thing is music in general. What is it? Why does it do what it does? Music makes me forget my real situation. It transports me into a state which is not my own. Under the influence of music, I really seem to feel what I do not feel, to understand what I do not understand, to have powers which I cannot have. It's really least of all connected, to say the truth. If it is connected at all, then in an idealist way, mechanically, with an empty sound, without associations. Music miraculously penetrates into the very soul. What is resonating in us in answer to the harmonized noise, and turns it into the source of great delight and unites us and shakes us? What is its purpose, and above all, for whom? Tarkovsky clearly thinks about the abstractness or irrationality of music, as do a lot of people. Some things are more explainable than others. Film, literature, figurative art, sex, perfume, food and drink. Others are less so. Abstract art, music, sunsets, aspects of spirituality and meditations, love, dance, mass gatherings. Film and music, owing to that nature, sit at a crossroads from each other, intersecting but never running parallel. Tarkovsky himself would probably disagree with this, but that's fine. I'm sure I could appeal to an authority who would agree with me too. Ultimately, at the heart of Tarkovsky's musical world seem to be a series of paradoxes. Music is emotional and irrational, not explainable and logical. But what director fits that bill better than Tarkovsky, a man who himself said that if you look for meaning, you miss what happens? Tarkovsky says he believes that films, ultimately, could do without music, and yet he never even attempted to do this, despite exerting great control over his films, and being quite the artistic ideologue. He feels that a node of music is contextless and deplete of ideology, but that some music is more contextless than others. At the same time, those paradoxes seemingly come undone by Tarkovsky's most basic philosophy, that the totality of the universe is incomprehensible, and as such the poet's job is to make a work that expresses that as best as possible. Applying this kind of logic to Tarkovsky's musical world is often time wasted. He uses music in a fairly sparing and totally unique way, and this use is such a key part of why he is held in the regard he is. There's a wealth of literature on Tarkovsky's work and the music within it, and you could dedicate an entire lifetime to studying Mirror alone. As always, all the sources for this video are linked in the description, and all the specific citations can be found in the script in the description. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this video, you might also like my video Who's Afraid of Music, which touches on a lot of the more philosophical aspects of this video, or the film movement against film scoring about Dogma 95, and why they don't use non-diegetic music. Please feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts. I always love hearing what you all have to say about the music I talk about, and don't forget to subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you next time.